On New Year's Day, 1953, the music just stopped. There, in the back of a baby blue Cadillac, slumped over and silent, was the biggest star in country music, Hank Williams. He was only 29 years old. The official story was a heart attack. Clean, simple, and tragic. But the official story is almost never the whole story, is it? For decades, wild theories have been cooked up about his final hours, everything from a shady hotel room murder to a deadly bar fight, but the real story is so much more disturbing. It wasn't one single thing that killed Hank Williams. It was a slow-motion disaster. It's a story about a man crippled by chronic pain, betrayed by the very people he trusted, and finally, killed by a perfect storm of medicine, greed, and addiction. The mystery of Hank's last ride isn't about if his heart failed. It's about what pushed it to the breaking point. And when you connect the dots, the conclusion is impossible to escape, and it's not good. To understand how Hank Williams died, you've got to understand how he lived. And Hank Williams lived in a world of pain. Born in rural Alabama, he was born with a secret torment, a birth defect in his spine called spina bifida occulta. For Hank, this meant a lifetime of agonizing, non-stop back pain. This constant suffering became the ghost in his music, the sorrow in his voice that earned him the nickname, the Hillbilly Shakespeare. His songs, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, You're Cheatin' Heart, they weren't just hits, they were raw, open pages from his diary, put to a melody. By the early 1950s, Hank was a giant. He'd sold over 11 million records and was the main event at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. But behind the curtain, things were falling apart. The pain was always there. After a fall on a hunting trip in 1951, it got worse than ever. To deal with it, he turned to the only two things that seemed to help, alcohol and painkillers. His drinking, already a problem, spiraled. His marriage to Audrey Shepherd, a legendary storm in its own right, crumbled, and they divorced in 1952. His career took a nosedive, too. The Grand Ole Opry, the heart of the country music world, fired him in August 1952 for his constant drunkenness and for blowing off shows. He was an icon, but he was a mess. By the end of that year, Hank was a ghost of his former self, gaunt, sick, and suffering from chest pains. But even then, his song, Jambalaya, was a #1 hit. He was trapped in a horrible paradox. His career was built on songs about suffering, but that same suffering was killing him. He booked 2 huge comeback shows for the New Year's holiday, one in Charleston, West Virginia, and another in Canton, Ohio. These shows were supposed to be his big return. Instead, they were the last 2 dates on his calendar. In the last, desperate months of his life, Hank Williams fell into the hands of a man who would hit the accelerator on his path to destruction. His name was Horace Toby Marshall. Marshall called himself a doctor, a savior who could cure Hank's drinking and fix his pain. The reality? Toby Marshall was a predator. He was a convicted forger and a total conman with zero legitimate medical training. Some reports say he literally bought his Doctor of Science degree from a traveling salesman. Posing as a doctor, Marshall started feeding Hank a dangerous cocktail of drugs, amphetamines, Seconal, and, most critically, a powerful sedative called chloral hydrate. Chloral hydrate was a common sleep aid back then, but it was also incredibly dangerous, especially when mixed with anything else. Marshall claimed he could cure alcoholism with it and gave Hank a massive supply. A prescription Marshall wrote just 9 days before Hank died was for 24 grains of the stuff, a truly staggering amount. This wasn't medical treatment, it was poison. Hank was already hooked on morphine for his back and deep in his alcoholism. Mixing booze with chloral hydrate is a death sentence. The two substances together create a synergistic effect that slams the brakes on the central nervous system and, most dangerously, the heart. Hank was desperate for any escape from his pain, so he put his trust in a man who saw him not as a patient, but as a walking dollar sign. Toby Marshall wasn't just a bad doctor, he was a fake one, a charlatan whose reckless prescriptions loaded the gun for the final tragedy. On December 30, 1952, the final act began. Hank was at his mom's boarding house in Montgomery, Alabama, sick with the flu and in no shape to go anywhere. But his career was on the line, so he was determined to make the shows in Charleston and Canton. He couldn't find any of his usual drivers, so the job fell to a 17-year-old college kid named Charles Carr. Carr was home from Auburn for the holidays and agreed to drive the country superstar in his new baby blue Cadillac convertible. The whole trip was doomed from the start. A massive ice storm was tearing through the South, making the roads a nightmare. The plan was to drive to Knoxville, Tennessee, and catch a flight to Charleston for the New Year's Eve show. They left that afternoon, but by the time they reached Knoxville, the airport was awash. The plane tried to take off but had to turn right back around. The Charleston show was officially off. Defeated, they checked into the Andrew Johnson Hotel in Knoxville around 7 p.m. Hank was in a terrible way. He was feeling the full effects of the chloral hydrate and the booze he'd had on the drive. He also had a severe case of the hiccups, so bad they were causing convulsions. Carr, a teenager completely in over his head, called a doctor. A local physician, Dr. P.H. Cardwell, came to the room. What happened next was the point of no return. Trying to calm his famous patient, Dr. Cardwell gave Hank 2 shots of what he said was vitamin B12. But those shots were laced with morphine. So now, a frail and exhausted Hank Williams had alcohol, chloral hydrate, and morphine all flooding his system. It was the perfect storm of depressants. Porters at the hotel later said they had to physically carry Hank, who was coughing and convulsing, out to the Cadillac. Sometime around 10:45 p.m., with orders to push on to Canton for the New Year's Day show, Charles Carr pointed the car north and drove straight into the freezing night. The baby blue Cadillac was a lonely vessel, speeding through the Appalachian Mountains carrying a dying star. The roads were sheets of ice. At the wheel was 17-year-old Charles Carr, pushing through the night. In the back, Hank Williams lay silent under a blanket. Sometime after they crossed into Virginia, Carr pulled into an all-night diner in Bristol. He asked Hank if he wanted to eat. Hank said no. Those are believed to be the last words he ever spoke. The drive continued into the cold, early hours of New Year's Day, 1953. The exact moment of death is lost to history, somewhere on a dark highway between Bristol, Tennessee, and Oak Hill, West Virginia. The awful truth started to come out when Carr stopped for gas in Oak Hill just before sunrise. He looked in the back seat and saw the blanket had slipped off Hank. When Carr reached back to fix it, he touched Hank's arm. It was cold and stiff. A horrifying thought began to creep into the teenager's mind. He tried to move Hank's hand, but rigor mortis had already started to set in. Panicked, Carr sped to the nearest hospital. He ran inside and found 2 interns, frantically trying to explain what was happening. The interns walked out to the Cadillac, glanced at the still figure in the back, and delivered the final, grim news. "He's dead," one of them said. Desperate, Carr asked if they could do anything, if they could bring him back. The intern's reply was blunt. "No, he's just dead." At around 7 a.m. on January 1, 1953, Hiram Hank Williams was officially pronounced dead. He was 29 years old. The story of what really happened to Hank Williams is a chilling look at how genius and tragedy can be so tightly connected. The details paint a picture that's so much darker than a simple heart attack. If you find these deep dives into music history as fascinating as I do, please subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. And I really want to hear from you in the comments. Did you know about the role fake doctors like Toby Marshall played in Hank's life? And what song of his do you think truly captures the man's tragic genius? Let me know below. The official cause of death, written on the death certificate by a local coroner, was insufficiency of the right ventricle of the heart. Basically, acute heart failure. The autopsy also mentioned hemorrhages in his heart and neck. Bruises from a recent bar fight were noted but were specifically ruled out as a cause of death. So, on paper, case closed. A hard-living star pushed it too far. But that simple story buries the truth. The real cause of death wasn't a mystery, it was chemistry. A modern look at the facts shows that Hank Williams died from a lethal cocktail of drugs, the deadly interaction of multiple substances. Let's break down the poison. First, you have the chloral hydrate, the sedative supplied by the quack Dr. Toby Marshall. Chloral hydrate is a known heart depressant. But Hank was also drinking. The combination of alcohol and chloral hydrate is famously lethal. It creates a supercharged sedative effect that slams the brakes on the central nervous system, and most importantly, the heart muscle. Second, you have the morphine. In that Knoxville hotel, just hours before he died, Hank got 2 injections of morphine from Dr. Cardwell to stop his violent hiccups. Morphine is an opioid, another powerful depressant. When you add opioids to a system that's already flooded with alcohol and chloral hydrate, you create a perfect storm. The combined effect is a catastrophic shutdown of the body's vital functions. Breathing slows, blood pressure plummets, and the heart, already strained from years of abuse, simply can't take the toxic load. It just stops. This wasn't some random act of fate. It was the direct result of gross medical negligence and reckless self-medication, all fueled by a lifetime of pain. Toby Marshall, the conman, provided the poison with his phony prescriptions. Dr. Cardwell, whether he knew it or not, gave the final push with the morphine shots. And Hank himself, desperate for any escape, consumed it all. There was no secret murder plot. The truth is much colder. Hank Williams was killed by a chemical execution, a deadly, medically induced trifecta of chloral hydrate, alcohol, and morphine. For over 70 years, the death of Hank Williams has been wrapped in a fog of speculation. But when you clear that fog away, you're not left with a wild conspiracy. You're left with a profoundly human tragedy. The facts put the biggest myths to rest. One popular theory is that Hank died in the hotel in Knoxville and that his body was unknowingly loaded into the car. But Charles Carr, the only eyewitness, always insisted that Hank was alive, though terribly sick, when they left. Another myth claims that injuries from a recent bar fight killed him. But the autopsy clearly stated those bruises were superficial and didn't contribute to his death. The clearest truth is that Hank Williams's death was the predictable end to a life lived in torment. His chronic pain from spina bifida was the original wound, the one that sent him down the dark road of addiction. A fraudulent doctor, Toby Marshall, exploited that vulnerability, feeding his addiction with poison instead of providing real care. His heart did fail, but it was a heart pushed past its breaking point by a chemical combination that no 29-year-old body could ever survive. There was no secret plot. The story of Hank's last ride is a cautionary tale about the horror of chronic pain, the spiral of addiction, and the devastating impact of medical malpractice. He wasn't just a singer who wrote about sorrow, he was a man completely consumed by it, looking for relief anywhere he could find it. Hank Williams left behind a legacy that has shaped music forever, influencing everyone from Elvis Presley to Bob Dylan. His funeral in Alabama drew an estimated 25,000 people, a sea of fans who felt a deep connection to him. They didn't just love his songs, they felt his pain. The ultimate tragedy of Hank Williams is that the very suffering that fueled his timeless art was also what led to his early death. The mystery is solved, and the truth is just a sad, dark story about a man who gave the world his heart, long before it finally gave out in the back of a Cadillac on a cold New Year's Day.